Good day. Today is Wednesday, 19th March 2025, and yesterday in my program, I did a program discussing what I thought might happen over the course of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's telephone conversation later that afternoon. I said over the course of that program that it was quite likely that in many respects what I said would be superseded by events. Well, the conversation has now taken place. We have readouts and commentaries both from the United States and from Russia. And I get to say, briefly and in advance, that looking at things in the round, I think that my program yesterday got it, well, mostly right. In fact, I would go further. I would say almost entirely right. I say that with no desire to sort of make myself appear more prescient than I actually am. I've been following very carefully what the two sides have been saying over the last couple of weeks. I've been also doing that together with my friend and colleague, Alex Christoforou at the Duran. I think it was fairly clear what the trajectory of travel was, the sort of points the two sides would make to each other over the course of the telephone call. And in fact, there were no great surprises. So it's perhaps not so surprising that most of what I said, the greater part of what I said in my program yesterday ended up corresponding very closely to what we know now Putin and Trump actually did say over the course of their call. Nonetheless, we now do have readouts. We've had commentaries from Russian officials. We've had a very detailed and clear readout from the Russians. As is often the case, Russian readouts tend to be much more interesting and informative than American readouts. And this was certainly the case with this particular call. And for that reason, I'm going to focus on that readout. And despite what I've said about my program yesterday, anticipating much or most of what was actually discussed, I think it's a good idea to revisit this in this call, look at what the two men said to each other, look at what they did agree upon, and assess where we are. So with that, let me go straight to the Russian readout, and it's on the Kremlin's website. It was published literally within minutes of the call ending. The Kremlin made sure that there would be a readout almost immediately. And they also provided a proper English translation a very, very short time later. They did this clearly because they didn't want accounts of the call to start circulating in the West, which they might have to contradict. They wanted to get their own side of what happened out first. And if we go through the readout, we will see exactly why that might be. So let's start. And the readout reads, Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with President of the United States, Donald Trump. And the time of the readout is 20:15 hours Moscow time. And the readout then goes on to say this. The leaders continued their detailed and frank exchange of views on the situation surrounding Ukraine. Now that sentence already gives us an indication of the nature of the call. The leaders continued their detailed and frank exchange of views. Now, once upon a time, not so long ago, especially during the middle period of the Soviet Union, the period basically of the 1950s and early 1960s, Soviet readouts of conversations between Soviet leaders and leaders of other countries, if they contained the words that there was a full and frank exchange of views, that basically suggested that there was strong disagreements between the parties, and in many cases it was a euphemism for a row. Now, what we have in this readout, and it comes right at the start, is that the leaders continued their detailed and frank exchange of views on the situation surrounding Ukraine. Now, I don't think that those words today have quite the meaning that they did in Soviet times. But having said that, when they talk about a detailed and frank exchange of views, well, it may not have been a row. In fact, we can say definitely that it wasn't a row. Donald Trump has spoken about how he had a positive and substantive call with Putin. It was a good call, according to Trump. I think we can say that maybe there wasn't a row, but clearly there were disagreements and that there was some degree of argument and discussion over the course of what was apparently a very long call, one lasting 90 minutes. Some say it was much longer than that. Some on the Russian side say that it lasted 2.5 hours, but I think that is a mistake. It looks as if this was a 90-minute call. Anyway, the Russian readout then continues. Vladimir Putin extended gratitude to Donald Trump for his striving to achieve the noble goal of ending the hostilities and loss of life. So Putin, the Russians, understand the importance of this to Trump. They understood this before the incident in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky. They understood that in order to get on the right side of Trump, you need to show him respect. Donald Trump has been through an awful lot in the last couple of years. He's been through all kinds of lawfare cases. He comes in constantly for abuse in the American media, in the European media. There are always whispers and murmurs going on about Trump and his personality. The Russians have long understood that in light of this, you really want to get on the right side of Donald Trump, you have to show him a degree of respect that he just doesn't get from other people. Now, this isn't the same as flattery, which is something quite different, by the way. What we saw from Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron over the course of that disastrous trip they made to Washington, the same week when Vladimir Zelensky also went to Washington, and it all ended in the explosion in the Oval Office. Well, what we saw from Macron and Starmer, maybe especially from Starmer, during their two trips to Washington over the course of that disastrous week, a lot of that was flattery. In this case, it is an acknowledgement from Putin that Trump is doing his best and he's making real, serious efforts. But as we saw, it does not prevent Putin from engaging in a detailed and frank exchange of views. There's a difference, there's a significant difference between showing appreciation and respect and engaging in flattery. And as we will see, the rest of the readout makes it absolutely clear that there was no flattery provided at all. By the way, I ought to say that Donald Trump, it's quite obvious to me, is able to see the distinction between sincere respect provided and the kind of flattery he got from Macron and Starmer over that of the course of that disastrous week. Anyway, let's continue with the rest of the readout. Confirming his fundamental commitment to finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict, the President of Russia expressed willingness to thoroughly work out possible solutions in cooperation with the American partners aimed at reaching a settlement that would be comprehensive, reliable, and lasting, and naturally take into account the essential need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis as well as Russia's legitimate security interests. Now that is an extraordinary sentence. It's a very long sentence and it requires a lot of unpacking. So first we see Putin reassuring Trump that Putin really is interested in finding a negotiated solution to the conflict. And about that, I have no doubt that Putin is sincere. I've explained why many times, but to repeat again, for the Russians, the concern is to obtain security, long-term security on their western borders so that Russia can focus on its pressing internal needs. Putin said that in a speech that he gave to the Russian Foreign Ministry from recollection, September 2021, before the conflict in fact began, at least the kinetic part of the conflict began. He has repeated it many times. Other Russian officials have done so. There's no reason to doubt this. It is about security. It is about the rights of Russians and the safety of Russians, which for a Russian government is an obvious concern. It's not about a quest for territory or territorial aggrandizement or any of those things. And for that reason, Putin does have a sincere interest in achieving a negotiated solution. And he knows that in order to achieve that negotiated solution, he has to deal with the United States, because ultimately it is only the United States that can agree to provide that security on Russia's western borders, which the Russians seek. Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism has in many places pointed out that even if Russia were to conquer the whole of Ukraine, which, by the way, it undoubtedly has the capability to do, I will come to all of that later, that might not resolve the underlying issue for the Russians, which is the security of their western borders. If they conquer the whole of Ukraine and find themselves pitched into a permanent conflict with the West, they will not have achieved that security, which for them is their major objective. So that is why Putin reassured Trump that Russia does seek a peaceful solution. He is personally committed, fundamentally committed, as he puts it, to finding a peaceful solution to the resolution to the conflict. And for that reason, he is willing to, as the readout says, thoroughly work out possible solutions in cooperation with the American partners. And however, having said that, it has to be a resolution that addresses Russia's fundamental concerns. And he sets it out again, the readout sets it out. It must be comprehensive, reliable, and lasting. It must take into account the essential need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, as well as Russia's legitimate security interests. So that takes us back to the whole story of how Ukraine turned itself against Russia, how it became a threat to Russia, how it aligned itself with the Western powers, the enormous role the Western powers had through the manipulation of Ukraine's internal politics to create this situation of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the hostility of Ukraine to any manifestations of Russianness within its own territory, even though perhaps a quarter or even a third of the population speak Russian as their preferred language. The attacks on the Orthodox Church and all of that. And when, of course, Putin talks about legitimate security interests that Russia has, he means NATO's eastward expansion, the threat to bring Ukraine into NATO, the talk about stationing missiles, NATO missiles, American missiles in NATO, all of those things. And when he talks about ways to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and says that this must be done in a way that is comprehensive, reliable, and lasting, well, again, that inevitably leads us back to what I have called Istanbul Plus, the series of conditions that Putin outlined in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. Recognition that the four regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk, as well as Crimea, are part of Russia. Neutral status for Ukraine, secured through legal mechanisms that cannot simply be unlocked and reversed, at least not simply and with any simple mechanisms. Demilitarization of Ukraine, the reduction of its armed forces to the point where it can no longer pose a security threat to Russia. Denuclearization of Ukraine, given the constant talk in Ukraine about acquiring nuclear weapons and the way in which Ukraine has rewritten and in effect distorted the essence of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. I've discussed that in many programs. I'm not going to revisit this again today. And of course, denazification. Fundamental changes to the ideological makeup of the political system in Ukraine, because the Russians perceive this ideology that has established itself in Ukraine to be fundamentally hostile and antagonistic to themselves in a way that poses a continuing threat both to themselves and to Russian speakers, or ethnic Russians if you prefer to call them, within Ukraine itself. So Putin is not retreating from any one of these positions. There were some speculations before the call that Putin would make major concessions on territory to the Americans, that he would agree that parts of the four regions, those parts of the four regions that Ukraine still controls, should remain under Ukrainian control. There were speculations that he might agree to an unconditional ceasefire. We'll come to that in a moment. That he might agree to the deployment of peacekeeping forces from NATO countries like Britain and France in Ukraine. Well, in fact, we see that Putin is sticking absolutely to the position that he outlined in June 2024 to Istanbul, what I have called Istanbul Plus. And then we come to the ceasefire. Concerning US President's proposal to declare a 30-day ceasefire, the Russian side outlined a number of significant points regarding ensuring effective control over a possible ceasefire along the entire front line, as well as the need to stop the forced mobilization in Ukraine and rearming the armed forces of Ukraine. It was noted that some serious risks exist pertaining to the intractability of the Kiev regime, which had repeatedly sabotaged and violated negotiated agreements. An emphasis was made on barbaric acts of terrorism committed by Ukrainian militants against civilians residing in the Kursk region. It was pointed out that a complete cessation of providing Kiev with foreign military aid and intelligence must become the key condition for preventing an escalation of the conflict and making progress towards its resolution through political and diplomatic means. Now, this is a very important set of points from Putin. He is making it clear that to Trump that the various concerns, the so-called nuances that he spoke about in his press conference, the one that happened on Thursday last week, the one which Lukashenko attended, the various nuances are not just nuances, they are real concerns and they are real conditions. He wants an end to intelligence sharing by the United States and the Western powers. He wants an end to foreign military aid to Ukraine by the Western powers. This has to be part of a settlement, an overall final settlement of the conflict. And it also, I think, though the readout doesn't exactly say that, it also has to be a condition on agreeing a ceasefire. Because otherwise, given that Ukraine has repeatedly breached ceasefires in the past, if Ukraine continues to be provided with intelligence assistance, if it is continuously rearmed, then it will use any ceasefire, even a short ceasefire, one of 30 days, to redeploy its forces, reorganize, re-equip. In other words, it will abuse the terms of the ceasefire in order to put itself in a better military position and to hold out longer in a restarted war in which Ukraine will not have shifted from any of its fundamental ideas or proposals. That is Putin's concern. So his concerns, the concerns that he expressed over the course of the Lukashenko-Putin press conference on the 13th of March, those continue to remain in place. And the nuances have in effect now become conditions. And notice the word must. It was pointed out that a complete cessation of providing Kiev with foreign military aid and intelligence must become the key condition for preventing an escalation of the conflict and making progress towards its resolution through political and diplomatic means. So this is a condition. For the Russians now, it has become a key condition. That's the word that's set out there. A key condition if there is going to be a peace. There must not be a return to what happened after Minsk, the Minsk Agreement of February 2015, which also incorporated a ceasefire in which the West, in effect, rearmed Ukraine. Ukraine rebuilt its armed forces with Western aid, and the result was a return to war. Now, about the fact that Ukraine cannot be trusted to stick by ceasefires, well, I've already discussed this many places. I've discussed how it is now officially acknowledged by some of the people involved, including Ukrainian officials, including people like Poroshenko and indeed Zelensky himself, but also by some of the Western officials involved, Merkel and Hollande, for example, that Ukraine never had any intention of abiding by the Minsk Agreement. It simply saw the Minsk Agreement as an opportunity to gain time in order to rearm and reorganize and in effect, it saw it as an exercise in spinning things out and playing for time. Now, there's been an article in The Hill which, interestingly enough, makes precisely that point. It's by Alan Cooperman, who is a academic. He is professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he teaches courses on military strategy and conflict management. He makes it clear that he is not a friend of Donald Trump's. In fact, generally, he disagrees with him on many things. But the title of the article is, "Sadly, Trump is Right on Ukraine." And he talks in this article, Professor Cooperman talks in this article about the fact that Ukraine has a history of violating agreements. Ukraine's president, Vladimir Zelensky, contributed to a wider war by violating peace deals with Russia and seeking NATO military aid and membership. The deals, known as Minsk I and Minsk II, had been negotiated under his predecessor, President Poroshenko, in 2014 and 2015 to end the fighting in the southeast and protect endangered troops. The last is a reference to the troops that had been surrounded by the Russians in Debaltseve. Ukraine was to guarantee Donbass limited political autonomy by the end of 2015, which Putin would believe would be sufficient to prevent Ukraine from joining or serving as a military base for NATO. Regrettably, Ukraine refused for 7 years to fulfill that commitment. Zelensky even campaigned in 2019 on a promise to fully implement the Minsk Accords to prevent further war. But after winning election, he reneged, apparently less concerned about risking war than looking weak on Russia. Zelensky instead increased weapons imports from NATO countries, which was the last straw for Putin. So it is a matter of historical record. Many people want to deny it or refuse to acknowledge it, but it is a matter of historical record that Ukraine violates ceasefires. If you read the Western media, it's always the other way around. It's the Russians who violate ceasefires. Of course, Zelensky makes that claim repeatedly as well. But the historical record on this is absolutely clear. It is the Ukrainians who violate ceasefires, and for that reason, Putin is not prepared to accept an unconditional ceasefire, even if it is only for a period of 30 days. And ultimately, the objective must be, and this must form part of a peace agreement and a ceasefire process, that Ukraine no longer receives weapons from the West, is prevented from rearming, and no longer receives the intelligence assistance from the United States, which has proved so critical in enabling it to continue the war. Then Putin talks about the situation in Kursk region. The readout says, referring to Donald Trump's recent appeal to spare the lives of the Ukrainian servicemen surrounded in the Kursk region, Vladimir Putin confirmed that the Russian side was willing to embrace humanitarian motives and guaranteed that the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine would live and be treated fairly in accordance with Russian legislation and international law in the event of surrender. Now, there continue to be many people who deny that this encirclement of Ukrainian troops is even the case. Donald Trump has come out and now said that, in fact, around 2,500 Ukrainian troops are surrounded in Kursk region, what is left of the territory of Kursk region, where there are still Ukrainian troops, 2,500 men. And I think this is basically correct. There are some who claim that there's been few reports about the situation in Kursk region and that the Russian offensive there has supposedly ended. I find this very strange. Group of Forces North has provided its own account of what is happening in Kursk region. This is from its latest bulletin published yesterday evening. They report that in the Sumy direction, notice that it is no longer Kursk, it is now the Sumy direction. In other words, the Russians now consider Sumy the region in Ukraine from which the Ukrainians advanced into Kursk region in Russia. They consider Sumy region now to be a theatre of the war, a further reason to believe that the Russians will indeed advance into Sumy region very soon. In the Sumy direction, fierce fighting continues in the Gogolevka area and in the forest areas in the vicinity of Guyevo. From Guyevo, the demoralized enemy, including militants of IDA, that is one of the ultra-nationalist brigades with the ideology of the 1930s, are trying to escape in small groups in the direction of Sumy Oblast, Sumy region. The retreating enemy is destroyed by artillery and drones of Group of Forces North. Our total advance in Sumy region was 2.8 kilometers. 5 more units of enemy armored vehicles were destroyed. So the Russians are continuing to advance. They're continuing to clear Sumy region. And this account essentially tells us that there is indeed a Ukrainian force trapped in Kursk region, and that it consists of, perhaps it largely consists of, men from the far-right ultra-nationalist IDA brigade. Just saying. So that's that part of the discussion. Putin again reassured Trump that he's paying heed to Trump's request that the people in Sumy region, the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region, 2,500 of them, will have their lives spared if they lay down their arms. Then we come to the part of the readout that has attracted by far the greatest amount of attention. During the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to mutually refrain from strikes on energy infrastructure for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded favorably to the proposal and immediately gave the relevant order to the Russian troops. That's a very interesting paragraph, and again, I'm going to unpack it a little before dealing with the substantive issue of this cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure. Firstly, it's during the conversation. So, that suggests that there was a great deal of toing and froing between Putin and Trump over the course of the discussion, which eventually brought us to this point. I go back to what I said at the start of this program. The first words in the Russian readout talk about a frank and detailed exchange of views. And I said that this suggests an argument, perhaps not quite a quarrel, but anyway an argument. And it's not difficult to see what happened. Trump came along and said, I want a ceasefire. The Ukrainians have agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. Please agree to the ceasefire. And then Putin came back and said, no, I am not prepared to agree to the 30-day ceasefire. The Ukrainians have violated every ceasefire that we have ever agreed with them. We are not prepared to agree to that kind of ceasefire. Again, We want it monitored and enforced properly. We want a guarantee, commitment that military aid to Ukraine, not just from the United States, if we go back to the earlier section of the readout, it talks about military aid to Ukraine must stop entirely. There must be a complete cessation of providing Kiev with foreign military aid and intelligence. So the United States must stop providing Ukraine with military aid and intelligence, but so must the Europeans and other countries as well. Britain, France, Turkey, Germany, Australia, Canada, all of them must stop providing military aid to Ukraine during the period of the ceasefire and as part of any final agreement which has been negotiated after the ceasefire has been agreed. So that was what Putin said to Trump. So we can't agree to an unconditional ceasefire. We want a complete cessation of Kiev being provided with foreign military aid and intelligence, and we want careful monitoring of the ceasefire, and the arrangements to agree that are going to be extremely complex. We're not opposed to a ceasefire in principle, but unlike all previous ceasefires, we want cast iron guarantees that that will not be abused. And of course, Trump will probably try to push back on some of that, and there will have been, as I said, that frank and detailed discussion, exchange of opinions about this. It's quite possible that at some point Trump came up with Zelensky's proposal, which originally originated with Macron, for a complete cessation of operations in the air and on the sea. In other words, in effect, a no-fly zone. And of course, Putin will have shot that one down as well if it was ever raised. And then eventually, as the discussion went backwards and forwards, and again to repeat, the word clearly, the readout clearly shows this, during the conversation, Trump finally came up with a proposal that Putin could accept, which was a proposal for the parties to mutually restrain from strikes on energy infrastructure for 30 days. Now, here, again, we need to understand something, because it's quite likely, in fact, it's entirely plausible, that the original proposal for Trump was for a complete cessation of all strikes on energy infrastructure by Russia, on energy infrastructure in Ukraine, by Ukraine on energy infrastructure inside Russia. That was a proposal, by the way, that the Americans floated to the Russians during the discussions in Riyadh, the one where Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff spoke with Lavrov, Ushakov, and Dmitriev. And at that conversation, over the course of that conversation, the Russians shot that idea down. They said that they were not prepared to enter into an open-ended agreement to cease attacks on Ukraine's energy system. The most that Lavrov would say is that the Russians were not attacking those parts of the Ukrainian energy system that provided energy for civilians, that the Russian attacks on the energy system were exclusively intended to prevent military enterprises, defense enterprises in Ukraine operating. That, by the way, is a massive extension of the truth. The reality is that the Russians have been attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and it does affect the civilians as well. Anyway, that was, as I said, an idea that the Americans have raised before. It's likely that Trump raised it again, and Putin then pushed back, just as Lavrov did in Riyadh, and eventually they settled for a cessation of attacks, mutual attacks, on energy infrastructure of just 30 days. Now, there's a number of things to say about this. First, in military operational terms, this is not a concession by the Russians at all. Now, there's been a fantasy peddled in the West and by Ukraine. There's an article that appeared yesterday by David Blair in the Daily Telegraph, for example, but a former British defence attaché in Kiev also floated it, and I've seen some Ukrainian officials float it as well. There's been a myth peddled that this 30-day ceasefire actually works to Russia's advantage, because supposedly the Russians have hit all the targets in Ukraine's energy system that they can hit, whereas Ukraine's counter-offensive against the Russian energy system, with Ukraine's hundreds and hundreds of drones, that is only now getting into its stride, and it is now inflicting real damage on the Russians. That is nonsense. I have discussed this drone offensive that the Ukrainians are conducting against Russia's energy system many times. I've pointed out that it has had no discernible effect on the situation with energy supply within Russia itself. I pointed out that it has had no effect at all on the scale of Russia's energy exports. In fact, Russia's oil exports and LNG exports over the last couple of weeks have been increasing, despite Ukraine trying to increase the level of its drone attacks. I pointed out that the Ukrainian drone attacks are pinpricks, that they make no significant effect, have no significant effect on the colossal Russian energy industry. And anyway, we have claims by the Russians, which are almost certainly true, that the vast majority of drones that the Ukrainians launch against Russia are shot down. So the actual damage the Ukrainians are doing is minimal. By contrast, Russian strikes against the Ukrainian energy system, given the weakening, the steady weakening of Ukraine's air defenses, Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy system have been devastating. According to a Ukrainian official some weeks ago, 80% of electricity generation in Ukraine has been stopped. So we are not comparing like with like. Just saying. What makes this apparent concession by Putin meaningless in military terms is that it is limited to just 30 days. Now, here one needs to follow closely the pattern of the war, and specifically what John Helmer has referred to as the electricity war, Russia's offensive against Ukraine's electricity system. In most months, the Russians only launch one big missile strike against Ukraine's electricity system. Often, it is conducted with hundreds of drones. Then what happens? Hundreds of drones and hundreds of missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, sometimes hypersonic missiles. Then what happens is that the Russians wait several weeks before they launch another strike. And usually the interval between strikes is around 30 days. On rare occasions, the Russians have launched attacks on 2 consecutive days, and sometimes they've launched 2 big missile strikes against the energy system, the Ukrainian energy system, in any particular month. But it's fair to say that mostly during campaigns against the energy system, the Ukrainian energy system, the Russians confine themselves to 1 big missile strike a month. And these campaigns against the energy system tend to happen at specific periods. They're not constant right through the year. For example, we had relatively few strikes against the energy system over the course of the winter, and by my recollection, over the course of January and February, there were no missile strikes at all. There was 1 big missile strike, I seem to remember, around the end of the year, 2024, and then there were several weeks, about 8 weeks, when there were no significant missile strikes at all. So, when Putin says that Russia will not conduct missile strikes on Ukraine for 30 days, provided, of course, Ukraine in turn observes the ceasefire and doesn't conduct drone strikes on Russia's part of on Russia's energy system. Well, it's very likely, given that the Russians launched a big missile strike against Ukraine's energy system just a few days ago, that the Russians were not planning to launch any more big missile strikes against Ukraine's energy system for the next 30 days anyway. Now, the Ukrainians are not happy about this proposal. They're not happy about the entire conversation between Putin and Trump. This has to be, as Putin says, a mutual ceasefire, a proposal for the parties to mutually refrain from strikes on energy infrastructure for 30 days. The Ukrainians, according to the Russians, have already launched further strikes on Russian energy facilities. They have already breached the ceasefire. And this is, of course, completely unsurprising, because the Ukrainians do not want, ultimately, a ceasefire. They want to commit the United States, or to get the United States to recommit to Ukraine so that Ukraine can continue the conflict with American aid. So, breaching the ceasefire is almost factored in to this ceasefire agreement. And in fact, we've had comments about the latest Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian infrastructure facilities from no less a person than Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. And this is the TASS dispatch. Its title is "Ukraine strikes against Russian power installations are sabotage of agreements." And the dispatch reads, "The Kremlin views the Ukrainian army's attacks against power installations in the Kuban region of southern Russia as sabotage of agreements, according to Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman." Certainly, Peskov said, responding to a question whether attacks against Russian power infrastructure are viewed as sabotage and an attempt to disrupt agreements reached between Putin and Trump. Information has already been widely available about the command of the Russian president, the command of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of Russia, about termination of strikes against Ukrainian power facilities for the period of 30 days at the moment of launching these attacks. The Kiev regime has done nothing to cancel them. Therefore, such actions definitely run counter to these common efforts. Now, as I said, the Ukrainians will work to try to undermine this ceasefire, just as they have worked to undermine all of the others. And they will try to goad the Russians into resuming their attacks on the energy system. I predict what's going to happen over the next 30 days is this. The Russians will point out to the Americans, they'll point out to Donald Trump himself, that just as they warned, the Ukrainians are not abiding by this ceasefire, just as they are not abiding by any of the others. That will then reinforce the point the Russians have made about the Ukrainians not abiding by ceasefires, and will strengthen Russia's position in the discussions with the Americans about future ceasefires and future negotiations. I think that the Russians, who probably anyway have no plans for a big missile strike against Ukraine for the next 30 days, will probably not carry out a big missile strike against Ukraine energy facilities for the next 30 days. They don't want to annoy Trump or put him in a difficult position, so they won't conduct those strikes. But in the meantime, as I said, they'll be providing the Americans with details of all of Ukraine's violations of the ceasefire. The Americans, who will be tracking the events, will probably be able to verify this information for themselves. That will probably work to annoy the Americans further, to annoy Trump and Vance even further. And at the end of the 30 days, because Ukraine is not complying with the ceasefire, the Russian offensive, the electricity war will resume. So that is what I think we're likely to see. Anyway, we then have a further paragraph, just as favourable was the Russian president's response to Donald Trump's suggestion to implement a well-known proposal regarding the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. The leaders agreed to begin talks to further work out specific details of such an agreement. Now, here again, there is widespread confusion. This appears to be structured around the assumption that the Russians are implementing some kind of blockade of Ukrainian ports. They've never actually mounted a formal blockade of commercial shipping from Ukrainian ports. They've come to various agreements at various times, the so-called grain deal and all of that, to allow ships to leave and enter Odessa. They did object at one point to Ukrainian grain ships and complained that those grain ships were being used to ship military equipment into Ukraine. They found that countries in the global south, which rely on Ukraine for some of their supply of foodstuffs, were extremely hostile to any attempts by the Russians to interfere with the movement of any commercial ships from Odessa. And for that reason, the Russians stopped doing so, or made no serious efforts to do so. So there is in practice almost no obstruction to commercial shipping from Ukrainian ports. So for that reason, this agreement to talk about beginning talks to sort out some specific details to allow freedom of navigation, this is obviously for commercial shipping, in the Black Sea, again, is not really a concession by the Russians. The side which perhaps might be restricted here is Ukraine, which appears to have made, in fact, I've no doubt, has made a number of attempts to sabotage Turk Stream, the great underground gas pipeline that connects Russia with Turkey. And that's really the only, those are in fact the only real attacks on civilian facilities that are being conducted in the Black Sea at the moment. So anyway, we will see what comes. Now, yesterday, in my discussion of what was likely to happen between Putin and Trump, I said I ventured the view that perhaps Trump's comments about ports and power stations were not about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and about transferring Odessa to Russia, as many people were supposing. It might be about attacks on Ukraine's energy system and about access to Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Well, we see that in that comment, I was proved correct. That was what was in Trump's mind, not transferring the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to Ukraine in return for Odessa being handed over to Russia. By the way, there have been commentaries today in the Russian media, apparently I haven't seen them, but I've heard about them, where the Russians have made it absolutely clear that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is Russian and will remain so. Anyway, to continue, then I'll skip the next paragraph, which is about a prisoner exchange. I think that was the most important paragraph in the entire readout. The leaders confirmed their intention to continue efforts aimed at reaching a settlement in Ukraine bilaterally, with due regard in particular to the aforementioned proposals by the US president. For this purpose, a Russian and an American expert task forces are now being formed. I said in my program yesterday that the conventional approach to negotiations of this kind would be that the two presidents would speak to each other, that the Russians would come back and say that they're not prepared to agree to the ceasefire at the moment, that they would suggest setting up expert panels to work out all of the various issues in the ceasefire and perhaps in the final settlement, and then that the two presidents would actually physically meet in a summit meeting, perhaps in Saudi Arabia, and, well, then maybe we would get a ceasefire preliminary to the final agreement on a treaty. Well, that's exactly, it seems to me, what has happened. The Russians presumably suggested setting up expert teams. Trump agreed. I'm assuming it was Putin who came up with the idea. So who knows, maybe there was general agreement about that already, and we're going to see expert teams set up. Notice that there's going to be more than one. The readout refers to expert task forces. So there'll be some that will look at the ceasefire and how it's going to be monitored and enforced. Others will be looking at various aspects of the final agreement. But the key word is this. The leaders confirmed their intention to continue efforts aimed at reaching a settlement in Ukraine bilaterally. And if we go back to the very beginning of the readout, the president of Russia expressed willingness to thoroughly work out possible solutions in cooperation with the American partners aimed at reaching a settlement that would be comprehensive, reliable, and lasting. In other words, the United States and Russia are going to negotiate between them the end of the conflict in Ukraine. It's going to be a negotiation between Russia and between the United States. Ukraine will obviously participate to some degree, but it will not be the major party in the negotiations. Just as if we go back in time to the Paris talks that ended American involvement in the Vietnam War, the main parties were the United States and North Vietnam. South Vietnam came along for the ride, but it was the Americans and the North Vietnamese, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, who did the negotiations, the main negotiations. There's the same in terms of the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, the Afghan government of President Al-Ghani, basically was sidelined. It is exactly the same now. The United States has acknowledged that the conflict in Ukraine is a proxy war between Russia and the United States. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that, and other US officials have said that as well. It is logical, therefore, given that this is a conflict between America and Russia, that these are the two countries that negotiate its resolution. And that is what this readout tells us is going to happen. We've already had forewarnings of this. We had that in the Truth Social comment by Donald Trump of a few days ago. The one which said that Biden had got the United States into a mess with Russia, but Donald Trump was going to get the United States out of that mess. I pointed out how in that Truth Social post, Trump made no reference to Ukraine at all. He didn't mention the country by name. He didn't mention Zelensky anywhere in that post. We see that for Trump, this is a bilateral discussion between the United States and Russia. The Russians agree, and that is how the negotiations from this point on will be conducted. Now, lest there be any doubt about this, the point has been rammed home by Putin's number two, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, former president and prime minister of Russia, the man who heads Russia's military industrial commission. He's published a post on X in his usual inimitable style. And he put it like this. The phone call between Presidents Putin and Trump proved a well-known idea. There is only Russia and America in the dining room. On the menu, light appetizers, Brussels sprouts, British fish and chips, and Paris rooster. The main course is a Kiev-style cutlet. Enjoy your meal. Well, that puts it rather pungently, as is Medvedev's style, but there it is. You see it in the readout as well. The readout sets it all out implicitly. It sets it out elegantly. It will be the Russians and the Americans negotiating to end the conflict in Ukraine with each other. It will be a settlement at which they will work on a bilateral basis. So there it is. Now there are other things in the readout as well. There's discussions about the situation in the Middle East, an absolutely terrible situation in the Middle East, one that requires a lot more time than I can give it in this program. I will probably come to that in my next program. But they talk about how they're going to try and work together to try to stabilize the situation in the Middle East. And interestingly, the Russian readout says that the Russians and the Americans working together, joint efforts to stabilize the situation in the crisis spots, and by the way, establish cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation and global security. Another clear hint, by the way, that the Russians are proposing themselves as mediators between the United States and Iran. Just saying. But anyway, the readout goes on to say that these joint efforts between the Americans and the Russians to stabilize the situation in the Middle East will in turn, this is the words of the readout, contribute to improving the overall ambience of relations between Russia and the United States. So part of the purpose of Russia and America working together to try to pacify the situation in the Middle East is that it will make relations between the two countries still better. And then there were a lot of other things about how they will work together in mutual interest. Trump says that there was a lot of talk about the enormous economic possibilities if their cooperation is restored, which is probably true, but it's not the major Russian priority. And of course, Putin proposed ice hockey matches between the Americans and the Russians, and Trump expressed support for the idea, which, by the way, falls slightly short of saying that he agreed to it. So let's not buy ourselves mentally any tickets to watch these ice hockey games. They may happen or they may not, but to my mind, it's a secondary issue. So, a very interesting readout. One, as I said, which closely conforms with my expectations, the expectations which I set out in the program yesterday. The Russians are not agreeing to the 30-day ceasefire. And by the way, given the difficulties that they are outlining, I don't myself believe that there is ever going to be such a ceasefire, at least not any time soon. There are clearly lots of issues to sort out. The Russians, however, will have wanted to go into this conversation giving Trump something. They won't have wanted to appear completely negative. They understand that Trump wants to improve relations with Russia. They understand that he's going out on something of a limb by doing so. They want to help him because they want, going forward, a relationship with Trump so that they can, at least for a time, negotiate the terms of this conflict to provide themselves with security on their western borders, even if that is only for a period of years before there's a change of government in the United States and the United States again takes a more hostile course towards Russia. We will see in a moment that the Russians absolutely do expect that the United States will turn hostile to them again one day. I'll come to that shortly. But in the meantime, the Russians want to work with Trump. It is in their interests to seek a negotiated resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. They don't want to slam the door in Donald Trump's face. Even if they can conquer the whole of Ukraine, that will simply exacerbate their underlying security problems in Europe, which are precisely the problems that for the moment that they're looking to try to resolve. So, they didn't want to slam the door, and they wanted to give him something, and they gave him this 30-day ceasefire on the attacks on the energy system, the Ukrainian energy system. They must know that the Ukrainians are not going to comply, and that they're going to try and goad the Russians by launching attacks of their own on the Russian energy system. But these are pinprick attacks which the Russians can absorb, and in the meantime, Trump can go away and tell his critics and the American people that he's making genuine progress with the Russians. The Russians can also agree to Trump's comments about Trump's concerns about navigation in the Black Sea. There is no real problem with navigation in the Black Sea, at least not from the Russian side. So of course they can agree something with Trump about this, because they're not conceding substantively anything. And as to attacks on Ukraine's energy system, well, probably the Russians weren't planning any major attacks on Ukraine's energy system for the next 30 days anyway. So this isn't a big concession. But Trump, entirely understandably, of course, is presenting it as if it is. And notice, if you go to the American accounts of this meeting, the Americans generally avoid mentioning the fact that this ceasefire, this Russian agreement not to launch attacks on Ukraine's energy system, is time limited to just 30 days. So Trump has been given something to take back, and on the strength of that, he is making comments about how this was a positive call, how he's able to move the process forward, and that this enables him to show that he's actually achieving something with the Russians. And by the way, he is. Just to say this as well. If this proposal for a cessation of attacks on Ukraine's energy system had come from any other leader of the West, if it had come from Starmer, say, or from Scholz, or Macron, Putin would have turned it down flat. He wouldn't have agreed to any ceasefire, cessation of Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system at all, even for 30 days, even if the Russians had no plans for a major attack on the Ukrainian energy system over the course of that period of 30 days. I say that because by this point in the conflict, the Russians are in no mood whatsoever to give anything, even the slightest appearance of a concession, to the European leaders whom they completely despise. Go back to what Medvedev says. He talks about how the Europeans are the light appetizers, Brussels sprouts, British fish and chips, and Paris rooster. That tells you how contemptuous the Russians are for the Europeans now. The Russians would not have given such a concession, even, as I said, nominal concession as it is. It would have been Joe Biden on the phone. Just saying. In fact, Medvedev has spoken pretty critically about the British and the French already. He said in an earlier post, also on X, that Macron and Starmer are playing dumb. Time and again, they're told that peacekeepers must be from non-NATO states. No, we will send tens of thousands. Just lay it out. You want to give military aid to the regime in Kiev? That means war with NATO. Consult with Trump. And then Medvedev uses some strong language, which I'm not going to repeat. So the Russians would not even have made an appearance of a concession to the Europeans. They would not have made even an appearance of a concession to Biden and Blinken and Sullivan and that group. But they are prepared to give something to Trump. So there we are. Now, I'm going to say this. I think that this does point to an eventual resolution of this conflict, though it will probably take many, many months, longer than Trump would like, before we arrive at that point. Zelensky is already seething about this. He was clearly very angry and provoked by Medvedev's post. He says that Ukraine is not on the menu. That's an independent, sovereign country and all of that. And it has a right to make decisions about its future. Other Ukrainian politicians are saying the same. Yulia Tymoshenko, the person who Trump apparently wants to take over from Zelensky, she's also made similar comments. The reality is that by lending themselves to a proxy war by the United States against Russia, the Ukrainians have fallen into this trap. Ukraine effectively gave away its sovereignty the moment it allowed itself to become a part of a proxy war between the United States and Russia, a country whose military is now fully equipped by the West, mostly by the United States, a country which relies entirely, or almost entirely, for its intelligence on the United States, a country whose command and control systems are controlled mostly by the United States and the other Western powers, a country that relies on the communications of its military units on Starlink, a system provided by the United States, has to a great extent lost its independence. If the Ukrainians are now complaining about that fact, well, they have only themselves to blame. By looking to the West, or by relying on the West to pursue their own maximalist goals against Russia, and within Ukraine itself, by the way, they have, in effect, already given up their sovereignty. In fact, they started to do so way back in 2014, directly after the Maidan coup, when they appointed people like Natalie Yaresko, a US official, to be their finance minister, and when they had cabinet meetings, which I well remember, chaired by people like Joe Biden. So there it is. A direct negotiation to settle the conflict between Russia and the United States. This is not going to be resolved quickly. Putin, as I said, is not making any significant concessions. They will work on the ceasefires. At some point, probably, there will be some kind of a ceasefire. Though when that happens, the negotiation for the final settlement will probably follow very fast, and we could see this whole thing folded up. Well, I don't think within weeks, but say possibly before the end of this year. American pressure on Ukraine, by the way, is likely to grow as the negotiations gather pace, and anyone who thinks that this process is likely to be reversed, I will simply say this: maybe it will be. The British, the French, the Europeans, I don't think they've yet fully grasped the significance of what happened over the course of this conversation. The fact that the Americans and the Russians are going to negotiate this thing bilaterally with each other. But gradually, as they do, they will bring up whatever problem and difficulty that they can. So will other people. Zelensky, of course, will do everything that he can to sabotage this process. He already is doing so by continuing the drone attacks on Russia's energy system, just to say. So it will not be easy. But the fascinating thing is that in the one country in the West which really matters, which is the United States, there is very surprisingly little pushback against this process at all. It's quite clear that with the defeat of the Democrats in November, the conviction has gone out of Project Ukraine entirely. Clearly, within the Pentagon, within large parts of the US political class, amongst the elite in the United States, I suspect most of all within the military, there was a clear understanding that the conflict in Ukraine was being lost, and there was an acceptance that the United States really needed in some ways to extricate itself from what was shaping up to be a disaster. Now, of course, you still have people who are angry and who will protest about all of this. Sullivan and Blinken, of course, are still there. Victoria Nuland and her husband, Robert Kagan, will continue to write critical articles. The Institute for the Study of War, which they basically control, will be full of stories of betrayal. We will have some of that. We will even have, people on the Republican side, the people at National Review, for example, are already criticizing Trump for this process. But if I have to be honest, the criticism is far less than I could have ever imagined. And that suggests to me that understanding in the United States, at least, that the war is being lost is much wider than is being publicly acknowledged. So, the Europeans can protest, the Ukrainians can protest, but it will be the United States in the end that makes the decisions, and the United States has compelling reasons to pull out before the collapse comes, and that, in effect, is what it is trying to do. Now, there continues to be a lot of discussion about the limits of Russia's territorial claims. Many people who still want to see the conflict, who actually do generally, sincerely want to see the conflict end, still believe that the Russians will not press for full control of the four regions, including Zaporozhye, and even cities like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka within Donbass. I beg to disagree about this, and there's an article which has appeared in the Russian newspaper Kommersant, and it's by a Russian journalist. His name is Andrei Kolesnikov, which claims that over the course of the discussions, not the discussions between Trump and Putin that took place yesterday, but presumably other discussions, maybe when Witkoff came to Moscow last week, the Russians told the Americans that they not only expect all of the territory of the four regions to be handed over, to be transferred to Russia, but that they expect Ukraine and the West to recognize Russian sovereignty over the four regions. And according to Kolesnikov, Moscow expects that the West will recognize Crimea, Lugansk and Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions as part of the Russian Federation. In this case, Russia will not lay claim to Odessa and other territories controlled by Ukraine. So, the Russians supposedly have said that they will not claim Odessa, Kharkiv and other places as part of Russia, but only if the West formally recognizes the 4 regions as part of Russia. Now, I don't know how well informed Kolesnikov is. He may be completely wrong about this. He may be making it all up. I mean, I don't know anything about him. Though Kommersant is a very serious newspaper in Russia and should be taken very seriously. But this is information which comes from a Russian journalist in Moscow, with contacts presumably within the Russian leadership, or at least the Russian political establishment. So that perhaps signals that the Russians not only expect the 4 regions to be transferred in their entirety to Russia, but that they expect the West to recognize it. And that is going to prove incredibly difficult to agree. And, well, if it isn't agreed, then maybe, possibly, quite plausibly, the Russians will move further west, and Odessa and the whole Black Sea coast will eventually be expected to pass under their full control. On that point, by the way, just to repeat, I expect that the military developments in Ukraine will start to accelerate. I'll discuss that why in my next program. I think that many people who believe that this is going to be a prolonged war and that the Russians can only capture villages and all of that, and that it will take them 10 years to defeat Ukraine, are living again in a wrong reality from the actual one, just to say. So if this implied threat has been made, I think it is one that should be taken very seriously. And for the record, I've heard stories that Russian schools are now being provided with maps which show Odessa, for example, as part of Russia, though I cannot confirm this as of the program I am making today. Anyway, there we are. A very interesting discussion, but a very interesting conversation between Putin and Trump. But the key takeaway from it is that there's going to be negotiations to settle this conflict, and the Russians and the Americans will make the decisions. This is going to be where I end my program today. I'll be saying a lot more about all of this in my next program, but I've taken some time to go through the documents and to explain where we are. And tomorrow I will look at the military situation, some very interesting comments that Putin has made about sanctions. He clearly expects sanctions to be maintained against Russia and maintained against Russia indefinitely. And we'll look at also, no doubt, the situation in the Middle East. But this is where I finish today. So there'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs in our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.